Webinar. Perfect. We are recording. You know what? We're going to go ahead and get started. So again, hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference Education and Workforce Development Committee. Say that 5 times fast. My name is Derek Cantu. I'm a policy analyst here at CSG Midwest. And one of our roles is to provide staff support to open forums such as these to highlight advances in public policy related to education and workforce development. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this event. Now, before we get started, I also want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded. And a copy of the recording will be made available on the Council of State Governments website after this presentation, as well as the different PowerPoints that we're going to be using. Second bit of housekeeping note is that we ask that you please mute your audio to help reduce background noise. And third, that we hope that this will be an interactive session. So please be ready to participate in the discussion or ask questions following our guest presentations. Please feel free to either also place your questions or comments in the Zoom chat, or you can also use the raise your hand function during Q&A portions. Today's session is on the important subject matter of addressing the existential problem of teacher shortages. And it is also the subject of a recent policy brief that the CSG Midwest office produced last month. In that report, titled State Efforts to Combat Teacher Shortages, it explores various pieces of legislation that were passed in Midwestern state legislatures between 2021 and 2023 that implemented strategies to help recruit and retain teachers. A number of these strategies that were applied in Midwestern states, including changes to licensing requirements for teachers and substitutes, financial support for student and veteran teachers, and upskilling opportunities for paraprofessionals, will also be explored in today's session. In addition, CSG Midwest released 2 legislative trackers that identified bills related to addressing teacher shortages, including a list of measures that were signed into law in 2023, and a list of over 130 active bills that were introduced this legislative session across the region. Our hope is that you take advantage of these resources on our website and learn about the actions that are being taken place in neighboring states. Finally, before we officially kick off today's session, I want to remind you all that CSG Midwest regularly offers learning experiences like this webinar throughout the year. 2 upcoming events that I want to specifically highlight are the annual meeting of the Midwestern Legislative Conference and a webinar that's being hosted by the MLC Midwest-Canada Relations Committee. The MLC annual meeting is being held this year in Columbus, Ohio from July 21st to the 24th. And today is actually the last day to secure a hotel room for the conference. So if you are intending on going and you have not booked a hotel room yet, make sure to do so today. In addition to a number of thoughtful policy sessions and engaging keynote presenters, the Education and Workforce Development Committee will be offering 2 sessions that will touch on subjects related to the integration of education and workforce development planning and state policy, an overview of the science of reading literacy education approach, and strategies to decrease academic remediation. If you have the time, this really is going to be an outstanding event, and we'd love to see you there. And then the other event being held on Thursday, July 11th, the Midwest Canada Group will be holding a session, another webinar related to the province of Alberta's relationship with its Indigenous population. Information for both of these events can be found on our website at csgmidwest.org. And so now, without further ado, because I've been talking for way too long, I want to turn things over to Ohio Senator Herschel Craig, who will be serving as the co-moderator for today's session, and he will give us a preview of today's presentations. So, Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Derek. I certainly want to thank everyone for your participation in today's webinar. Thank you, Derek. As was mentioned, one of the stated goals of the MLC Education and Workforce Development Committee's work plan is to develop resources. For example, policy briefs for committee members and like-minded parties. The teacher shortage brief is the first report produced for this fairly new committee, and we are excited to offer this webinar to complement its release. As was referenced in the CSG Midwest brief, national data shows interest in teaching as a profession has dropped by 50% since the 1990s. And more parents are recommending their children not become teachers. This is alarming, as teachers are continually asked to take on additional responsibilities. The need to implement effective strategies to recruit and retain educators is critical. Through today's webinar, we will hopefully gain a better understanding of the scope of the teacher shortage dilemma, learn how states are improving data collection practices to better understand the problem, and hear multiple examples of strategies that are bearing fruit. Please note that following our guest presentations, we will set aside the remainder of our time for what I hope will be an engaging conversation among all participants. So please be prepared to jump in with your questions, comments, and observations when we open the floor for discussion. I will now turn things over to my co-chair of the Education and Workforce Development Committee and co-moderator for today, Representative Joel Kitchens of Wisconsin.
Well, thank you, Senator. And I also would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar today. I think you'll find it useful. Our first guest speaker today is Ryan Saunders, who serves as the Deputy Director of State Policy at the Learning Policy Institute. Ryan also supports the work of the Teacher Licensure Collaborative and the Educator Preparation Laboratory. Before joining LPI, Saunders worked at the Council of Chief School Officers, supporting educator preparation systems change at the state level through the Network for Transforming Educator Preparation. His work included a focus on teacher recruitment and retention across 15 states. Earlier in his career, Ryan taught high school social studies and literature in Turkey, the Dominican Republic, and Denver, Colorado. In Denver, he served as a teacher leader for the Literacy Design Collaborative. Ryan is here today to give a 30,000-foot view of how states across the country are addressing teacher shortages and the policy solutions that are proving successful. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction. And also thank you all for joining us. And thank you to the Council of State Governments Midwest for hosting this conversation and putting a spotlight on what is such a kind of challenging topic. The Learning Policy Institute started back in 2014, 2015. And one of the first things we did was start sounding the alarm on teacher shortages. And unfortunately, the conditions, prior to the pandemic weren't good and weren't really kind of heading in the right direction. And unfortunately, coming through the pandemic, we still find ourselves facing some of the same headwinds in this work. I am going to talk mainly about state policy. I'll make some connections with federal policy, and I'll also make some connections to local policy. And hopefully we can have a nice, robust discussion about kind of some of the policy responses that have demonstrated some of the most impact, and also ways to generate investment and kind of political support for these types of movements, because they are so important to making change in the long term. So as some background on the Learning Policy Institute, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We produce evidence-based policy and practice research that can inform education policy and practices to support an equitable and empowering education for every child. And we work with the gamut of kind of everyone in this ecosystem and beyond, in terms of at the state level, federal level, and local level. And then beyond our educator quality work, we do quite a bit of work on early childhood education, community schools, equitable resources and access, including school finance work. And we do quite a bit on assessment and accountability as well. Before we get going, I am a former teacher. And so as I kind of flagged, like I experienced teacher shortages both from within the classroom, having teachers next door to me both leave in the middle of the year in Denver, Colorado, and me having to take on an AP course because they were my students the previous year and I wanted them to be ready for the exam. So I gave up my planning period to help them get ready. And it just puts an extra pressure on everyone in the school, in addition to the research that shows it impacts student achievement. So just to kind of ground us in some of the broader research on, teaching and learning, we know that teacher preparation, certification, and experience and stability matter for student achievement. And we've seen that borne out in large-scale studies in North Carolina, New York, and California most recently. We also know that the preparation of teachers is really significant for their retention. With teachers who receive comprehensive preparation, and I'll get into like what that actually means in a moment, but receiving comprehensive preparation increases your likelihood of staying in the profession 2 to 3 times more compared to someone who doesn't receive that preparation. And I'm going to put a little spoiler alert here for the next part of my presentation. More and more teachers are entering the profession without comprehensive preparation. And then the last piece here is that all of this has deep concerns for access to quality teaching for our learners and students, with students of color and students from low-income families being disproportionately taught by underprepared or unprepared and inexperienced teachers. Again, all that has an impact on their achievement. So we've done back in 2018, and then more recently in 2023, we did a national scan of the nature of teacher shortages. And I think what we've tried to do in our work, and particularly with partners, is, we want to give a national landscape, and we've used national data sources to provide the window I'm going to be giving you into the workforce. But we've also leveraged state level data in studying about 22 to 25 states and their vacancies. Unfortunately, learning and understanding the vacancies of every state is incredibly hard because that data is not always tracked accurately at the state level. And some states are just starting to build their data systems to do some of that work. So one thing I will stress at the very end of my presentation is that data and building data capacity is really going to be a significant step in better understanding the nature of shortages and also helping us track the impact of any policy response we deliver in the next years. We know from the data, and just to be clear, Learning Policy Institute, we often do very conservative estimates because we know that there's going to be a lot of questions about how we came to these conclusions. So in a recent scan of state-reported teacher data, that we found that at least 314,134 positions in schools went either unfilled or filled by teachers who are not fully certified for their assignment. That's about 1 in 10 teaching positions nationally. And that has implications for at least 6 million children and their learning. So that's just, again, to give you I don't know if that's like NASA level view of teacher shortages in terms of, I know I'm supposed to do a 30,000 foot, but I also want to kind of drop down there. We have this, our teacher workforce map goes both nationally and state by state to try to look at things like teacher attractiveness, teacher equity, and then the supply and demand. There are over 40 indicators that we looked at, and the goal there is, again, to help policymakers better understand the nuance of shortages. Because shortages are driven primarily by teachers leaving the profession, over 9 in 10 positions are, 9 in 10 positions that need to be filled are for people leaving the profession. And so helping policymakers think about both the front end of the pipeline, the supply, but also really thinking through that to consider the retention and how we develop policies that are supporting practicing teachers, but also principals, because they are a significant part of how working conditions shape for teachers and how they feel about their job. Oh, so the last thing, I encourage you to get in there in terms of where your state is. And if you have specific questions about data from your state, we can certainly talk about that. And that's also something that at a later date, if you wanted to chat, we could have that conversation as well. So this is just kind of the national look at both how we developed our attractiveness rating and our equity rating. And it gives you a sense, again, we don't feel it's enough just to say there is this many positions that aren't filled. It's better to try to get down and understand the nature of salaries, the nature of early career mentoring and support. And I just want to take a moment to highlight some of the indicators that for this conversation in state policy, I think are incredibly significant for when you're thinking about what to do. I'll also just flag Unfortunately, there is not one panacea silver bullet policy I can tell you to do for this work. If it existed, I believe we would have found it and we would have everyone doing it. But unfortunately, we have to stress that this is a comprehensive thing. It's about developing policies for the front end and the pipeline, and also further throughout, as I've kind of stressed. So some key areas to explore as you're thinking about the work, and I'll get into some of the details through this in my presentation, but if you are pulling up the map and just curious, mentoring for early career teachers is something that if you receive comprehensive mentoring, which includes having a mentor who is close or in your same subject area, having protected time to work with that mentor, because often, and then this happened to me as a first-year teacher, you are sometimes given some of the hardest assignments, whether, it's like the load that no one else wants anymore. And so we've tried to help states think about how you design mentoring to support new teachers in their learning, support the school, but also how you provide that protected time for the new teacher and the mentor so that they get time to spend together. And we also know that it's helpful for new teachers to get to observe other teachers who are really good at their work. We're also going to look at financial strains on teachers, whether that's the debt burden or issues with salary, access to housing. We know leadership support is significant. When it comes to survey results at the national level, administrative support is often flagged as one of the most important critical factors. So we do talk a lot, not just about teacher training and preparation, but also the subsequent, what does it mean for leaders? Because leaders are the closest thing to developing the working conditions that teachers work in, and ultimately working conditions are learning conditions, and that all impacts student learning as well. And then we also encourage you to look at the gap in percentage of inexperienced teachers between higher and lower poverty schools, because again, there are, when I show you some data from Texas and Missouri, you'll see that more and more teachers are both inexperienced and also coming through underprepared, uncertified pathways. And so we want to be conscious of where those teachers are teaching, because that often is an issue of equity. And also it's important to think about when it comes to where your resources are being put to help develop the skills of those teachers if they are in the classroom. And then we'll look at the teacher preparation pipeline. A lot of the work I do is on teacher preparation. And I think that sometimes it's misunderstood from just a supply perspective. So I'm going to try to highlight a little bit of how it impacts long-term retention. So I mentioned I was going to talk about what it means to be comprehensively prepared. There's a lot of great research that looks into what it means to prepare teachers to impact student learning, but also prepare teachers to retain them long-term. And so teachers who participate in content-specific training, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great career changers out there who have expertise in a lot of fields that could come into the high school or middle schools in their areas and help students learn. But there is learning science and the knowledge of how young children and young adults develop that is significantly important for their ability to support learning. And that is something you learn in teacher preparation. It's about taking the content knowledge you have and thinking about how to bring a novice or someone who is not interested in that topic into those opportunities and developing that knowledge. So that's a key part of quality teacher preparation. Knowledge of teaching and learning and how people develop, and also intensive opportunities to practice with a mentor. Ideally, in a perfect world, comprehensive preparation would have you as the person learning with your mentor, protected time, not necessarily taking over your classroom, not the teacher of record, and you having time with your mentor. And that mentor, it's important to remember, being a good teacher does not mean you're going to immediately be a good mentor. We need systems to develop the skills of mentors to work with novice teachers. And we need incentives to both encourage people to become mentors, a challenge many states are facing right now, and also reward them for sharing their expertise and committing that time to working with the new teacher through incentives and stipends that can support mentor teachers. So just to kind of drive home this piece about more and more individuals across states are entering teaching through pathways that bypass comprehensive preparation. This is data from Texas. We did a deep dive in the Texas educator workforce. And this chart, just to give you a sense, that big orange bar that just keeps growing, those are alternative non-IHE based program enrollment, generally nonprofit online programs in Texas. And one of the challenges with those programs, this data revealed, is people enter those programs, but we don't know when they exit. There's a lot of confusion about if people are ever exiting these programs. And as you can see, more and more of them are entering over time. And you can kind of see over the past decade in particular. This gives you another window. New teachers in the workforce who are being brought in, they again are entering on emergency permits, no certificate at all. And there are plenty of policies that can allow that, whether you're an emergency sub in the state, there's ways. And when you look at your licensure system, I can certainly talk about different states and how it looks. Just as an example, in Pennsylvania, you could be hired on an emergency certification. And I think the window is 3 years you could serve on that, but you could also get extensions for assessments and other coursework so that up to 5 years you could possibly be teaching without any preparation or some small coursework. So again, just driving home the point that a lot of what we're trying to do is drive people on the front end into quality pathways that we know are going to give them the skills to help students learn and also keep them in the profession. I want to quickly show you data from Missouri because Texas is not alone in this trend. This was data from the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. They were having conversations in their state and wanted to show the Board of Education just how things stood when it comes to people entering the profession. On the right side, you have people entering through comprehensive preparation, and these are the systems that policies often cover when it comes to what people should be learning, how do we support them, how do we ensure they're getting the learning and opportunities they need in clinical practice. And on the left side, and they obviously chose a good color here with red, those are all the people who are entering through routes that are not covered by that oversight or those opportunities to learn, really. And you even have the individuals with no certification there at the end. So again, this is just to drive home that even when you develop policies to support preparation, say for the science of reading, you still have a giant percentage of teachers in some states who are not getting access to even some of that learning. So even legislation at that level, just focusing on traditional teacher preparation, is not going to cover the full extent of teacher learning that's needed to support people. Last thing, if you're curious, here are the breakdown of those different pathways. You'll get the slides. I'm not going to belabor this part here, but I encourage you to come look more closely at this slide to just better understand the difference in those preparation routes in Missouri. And again, I will just say, I've worked in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Washington, California, not West Virginia, Virginia, also, sorry, West Virginia and Virginia, Maine, Vermont, number of other states. And I can tell you, they all have various pathways that mirror what we're seeing in Missouri. So the other thing we know, another big driver of challenges of bringing people into the profession and also keeping them is student debt. We did an analysis of the landscape, and I'm going to pull up just to make sure I get the actual wording of this correct, because sometimes my colleagues, I can be a little, okay. So they did a study of the National Teacher and Principal Survey of 2020-2021, and that study provides a national look with state-specific data on student loans, like what individuals have student loans, the size of those loans, whether they have second jobs outside of the classroom, and several other variables related to student debt and the burden of debt. You can access those maps here. I encourage you again to look at that and pick it out from your state to better understand how those pieces play. So we found that over 60% of all full-time public school teachers, that's about 2.1 million teachers, have taken out student loans to pay for their education. And 1.3 million are in repayment on their student loans. So that's about 1 in 4 teachers. And then 400,000 still owe their entire balance. And the average monthly payment for a teacher is about $342. And as you can see here, the ongoing debt burden falls hardest on Black teachers, as well as Latino and Native American, Hawaii Pacific Islander teachers, and multiracial teachers. More than 30% of Black teachers still owe all of their student loans, and almost 60% owe at least some of their loans. The other piece here is, cost aside, access to high quality teacher preparation is unequal. And this slide points to what disparities look like at the state level. Data from California is represented here. And we did a study that analyzed survey results from program completers and people seeking licensure in California. And that's about 60,000 individuals that we looked at the survey responses from over the past 5 years. And the study found that candidates who came through student teaching and especially residency pathways were more likely to rate their program as highly effective and feel well prepared to enter teaching. It is also found, this study, that Black and Native teacher candidates were the least likely to have those kinds of high quality preparation experiences. And only 46% of Black and 50% of Native American completers reported participating in student teaching or residencies, compared to at least 2/3 of all of the racial and ethnic groups. Preparation costs, including whether you can earn a salary, pay the bills while doing a residency or student teaching, and learning alongside an expert mentor, is a key driver of why candidates might choose to enter teaching through an alternative certification program or an emergency style permit. So again, the incentives here, when you think about that Missouri graph, and it's about half of the people in Missouri entering teaching, it's cheaper and faster to go that left side where there's very little preparation or supports. And the job of policy now seems, how do we increase access to the more comprehensive routes? And part of that is investing in ways to encourage people and lower the cost of preparation for individuals. I'm going to talk a little bit now. I'm going to shift to looking at policy that responds to these challenges. And the big piece here is broadening access to high quality preparation. I'm going to look at some pieces related to teacher compensation, and then I'm going to also talk a little about school leadership. These are by no means comprehensive of all the possible policy solutions. They do reflect a number of the key trends from the CSG brief, and that we'll also hear about from the next presentation in Illinois. So there's a lot of work that's been done around teacher residencies, grow your own programs, and registered apprenticeships. They carry different names, but there is some heavy overlap in how these programs look and what they're trying to do to support individuals coming into teaching. States can cover, another piece in addition to these pathways, that states can cover most or all of the cost of teacher preparation in exchange for a commitment to teach in a high-need field or school, including rural schools, by investing in service scholarships or loan forgiveness programs. The notion that if you will teach, we will pay for your education can be a powerful recruitment and retention tool. And we have seen that in longstanding programs in North Carolina, and even some new ones in places like Oregon and West Virginia more recently. All of these strategies serve to broaden access to preparation and reduce barriers to entry, especially financial ones, as opposed to lowering standards for teachers, which can too often seem like an easy fix to solving teacher shortages. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about teacher residencies and then connect them to grow your own and apprenticeships, because I know apprenticeships is likely something you've been talking about or been working on in your state. And I just want to draw some comparisons and patterns in those different pieces. So teacher residencies modeled after medical residencies. They provide candidates with an opportunity to co-teach alongside an expert mentor for a full residency year. And the key piece here is that it is all on the foundation of a partnership between the district and the teacher preparation program, which allows them to tightly integrate coursework so that we can't be accused of the kind of like, oh, the theory doesn't meet practice. This is bringing the coursework into your daily experiences when you're a student teacher or a resident and being able to reflect on how those things are connected. It's also programs that have been successful have typically lowered the cost or provided free access to candidates and often come with a stipend in exchange for a service commitment to work in the sponsoring district. So the other benefit here is if you do a residency in a district that maybe has had challenges with turnover, you develop and you learn in that district and you build rapport with those students so that it is easy to then make that transition to becoming a teacher, a full-time teacher the next year in that district. And there's been a lot of evidence of the impact of that. But also, you bring benefits to your mentor teacher when you spend that much time working closely with them. And I think that's another key piece where people forget. A teacher residency isn't just about that novice teacher learning to become a teacher. It benefits the broader school because you have another person who is building the skills and can do a lot of work, maybe doing emergency subbing periodically, helping tutor students, but also help build the skills of the mentor teacher. Another key piece the teacher residencies also develop or build in, and this is sometimes reflected in policy, but not always, is they have a requirement for additional support after you become a full-time teacher. So there's mentoring support that can extend for another year or 2 years, which again is really important because that's sometimes the most crucial part of whether you'll stay in the profession. This is just to give you a map on where teacher residencies are being developed across the country. To be clear, this map is not comprehensive. There's a lot of policy that's not reflected here. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is both the combination of policy that supports residencies and investments. And we've seen states invest both state level dollars, recently ESSER funds to jumpstart programs. And that's happened in Mississippi, that's happened in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, California, Washington, Montana. And I'll just also give you a sense. To take an example, California, the investment that California has made over the past 5 years, which is about $670 million over 5 years, it's much larger than even federal investments in residencies over the past same time. So some states have a chance to step up. There's a chance to invest state dollars. ESSER dollars have been used, and we'll continue to kind of follow that. Another element of intensive clinical practice preparation, and this speaks to the CSG memo related to supporting the skills of paraprofessionals, are grow your own programs. We've seen these developed as high school pathways. So going into high schools and trying to generate interest in teaching, speaking to that data about fewer and fewer students are wanting to become teachers, and trying to help people better understand what it means to be a teacher and give them a chance to learn and practice it before they even make their decisions to go into prep. There are 2+2 programs, which are partnerships between community schools and four-year institutions that allow individuals to get early credits in community college that can then transfer to the full four-year program and can often lower the cost of becoming the teacher, but also in some instances speed it up. And we've seen examples of that in Mississippi and a number of other states. And then the other piece here is, in addition to paraprofessionals, we've seen this used for classified staff, expanded learning staff, developing substitutes into full-time teachers, and early learning staff. And I think this is the other piece for school leaders, which we'll hear more about shortly, is thinking about the pool of available teachers as every adult in your school is someone who's working with students, and to really think about how to build the capacity of everyone to think about becoming a teacher, because that's kind of the state we're in when it comes to the available pool of interested people. And the other piece is we're recruiting from the community and grow your own programs. Sometimes a grow your own program may be a teacher residency and it just labels itself grow your own. But the big piece here is you're recruiting from the community. So you also have the ability to bring individuals in who are connected to the students, know the community, and then you can provide individualized supports for that individual to help them progress while possibly in a lot of instances still working as a paraprofessional or their other positions, still making money. And there are ways to develop career ladders through that. And finally, registered apprenticeships. They are of increasing interest for states. And just, you may already know, but just to kind of make sure you do, they are paid apprentices. And there's a graduated expectation of increasing pay for individuals as they go through their program. There's on-the-job mentorship, which may sound very similar to the teacher residency and grow your own programs. There's related instruction, which is more or less that integrated curriculum and coursework as we talked about in residencies. And you develop nationally recognized credentials. Well, just going to flag, there was a brief we put out in partnership, the Pathways Alliance, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, that looks at Tennessee's support for apprenticeships. Tennessee jumped out ahead of a lot of states in developing their program. It was previously a grow your own program that they registered as an apprenticeship with the Department of Labor. They invested ESSER dollars in it. And they also stood up an intermediary technical assistance center, the Tennessee Grow Your Own Center. And that center has played a pivotal role in helping programs continue to refine and implement their models, but also seek out funding, because ultimately in Tennessee, after their ESSER dollars are done, they are still working to figure out where the next big pot of money will come to further sustain that work. They have some money from the state, but it is much less than what they had for ESSER dollars. So I'm going to try to speed up. I know I'm taking a lot and I apologize. I appreciate you staying with me. For those who are thinking about apprenticeships, there are national guideline standards for apprenticeship standards for K-12 teacher apprenticeships developed under the Pathways Alliance in a working group with all of these organizations here. LPI was a part of it. And these guideline standards are for those both state and program people thinking of developing their programs. It was approved by the Department of Labor, so it indicates where the priorities are for a Department of Labor when they're approving programs. And it also sets a kind of clear understanding for developing a high quality program. Some funding sources, and again, I won't belabor this, you can come back to these slides. These are various federal funding sources to support apprenticeships. And I will just say, Apprenticeship funding, there was a lot of thought that there would be a lot of money available. And the reality is the money is existing federal dollars that you now have to think about how you might braid them in different ways to leverage your priorities around apprenticeships. There are some grant programs at the federal level, but they are not, broad, big grants. And so I encourage you to think about all of these funding sources if you are thinking about apprenticeships. I did talk about induction and mentoring. So thinking about we've increased access. If we did policy in a perfect world, we increased access to high quality preparation, and then we get individuals into teaching. We need to develop state funded models for induction and mentoring. That doesn't mean the state sets off all the parameters that every district has to develop for their mentoring program, because that becomes really untenable when you think about the different districts and challenges they face. But states can develop state level funding, which can create more equitable access to comprehensive induction so that it doesn't just come down to if your superintendent and principal prioritizes it. And we've seen examples of that in West Virginia, where they provide formula funds based off the number of new and second-year teachers in your county. And we've also seen Pennsylvania recently kind of modify a grant program that was for residency to also include mentoring, induction, and expanded clinical practice. And they're leveraging Title II Part A dollars, federal dollars, to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about compensation. I'm going to try to wrap this up. And again, thank you all for sticking with me. And I haven't looked at the chat, so if I'm missing some questions, please jump in and interrupt me if I'm like way past a question that would have been helpful to answer. What I'll say is we know raising salaries will influence both the quantity and quality of applications for open teaching positions. Higher salaries are also associated with lower teacher turnover. Salaries are not everything, because we also know, we saw a number, like I worked in Denver. I got a bonus for working in a hard to staff turnaround school of about $5,000 when I was working in Denver. But that salary, that stipend, the evidence has shown, if your working conditions are terrible in your school, that bonus will not keep you there long term. And so we need to think about both salary in relation to the working conditions as well. And I know that's going to get talked about in the next presentation, so I'm going to keep moving. Some strategies here. So yes, overall increases, and we've seen that in all kinds of states. I was just at an event in Mississippi last week. Mississippi was, they were last in the country in their region in particular, and they did a whole push back in 2022 to raise salaries, both for new teachers and for experienced teachers. And I think this is a piece, there was a good report on Arkansas where they raised new teacher salaries, but basically compressed older experienced teacher salaries such that once you hit the peak of salaries, you'll stay at that salary for the foreseeable future, and that likely is going to have a huge impact on retaining experienced teachers. And just to be clear, teachers do increase their efficacy over time, and we need experienced teachers in the classroom. Also, finally, I'm going to put a plug here for increasing leadership roles and expertise. National board certification has demonstrated positive impact on student learning and also teacher retention. And there is some early evidence that national board certified teachers also help novice teachers develop their skills when they're serving as mentors. So going back to that whole issue of being a mentor and needing new mentors, if your state were to stand up an incentive for national board certification or expand it to draw more teachers to hard to staff, high need schools, there's demonstrated impact in a number of states, Washington State, California most recently, that you'll have more teachers becoming national board certified, which increases their effectiveness. And you start to have more teachers in schools kind of collected together, national board certified teachers, which can help leaders, because there's a lot of leadership that can come from national board certification. And I can talk more about that on the side if that's of interest. Other things, loan forgiveness, housing incentives, childcare incentives. Mississippi's, their bill, they had loan forgiveness built in and housing incentives, down payment assistance as well. I'll keep moving. Finally, principals matter. High quality principal learning is positively associated with teacher satisfaction and retention. So if you can build quality principals as you're building quality teachers, you are working in the perfect direction. There's a lot of research on how to support principals. We did a whole look at principal learning. I'm not going to go into this because I know my time is running out. I appreciate the chance to share this stuff, but you can come back to the slides and always ask questions as we go. And then the policies that strengthen school leadership. At the state level, there's a lot about licensing and how programs are approved and designed, and that's a state lever, same as teachers, but I think a lot of states kind of miss that part for principals. I'm going to give a shout out to Illinois for just amazing work they've done on principals in that space, being really a national leader. Obviously, I'm not the expert on that one in particular, but I just encourage you to learn more about that, and I have some people connect you with as well if that's of interest. And finally, yeah, just stressing school leadership as something not to forget in this space. Oh yeah, sorry, you can use 3% set aside. I'm just going to make a note of that. Finally, data systems. Just to give you an example, West Virginia, over the past 5 years, they developed a mandate for residencies for all their traditional pathways. And then at the same time, the legislature created a whole bunch of other pathways that bypassed traditional teacher preparation. So the state this fall is just going to start standing up a data system that will be able to track the number of individuals entering through those different pathways and then follow them to see if they stay in the profession, if they graduate. And that's all data that every state should try to have now. Because of the way pathways have developed, it's really crucial that you're able to look and see the persistence of people through preparation across all pathways, whether they're retained, where they go to teach. Are they teaching in high need schools in the places they're needed most? And better understanding those types of important features of the workforce. I apologize. I think I might have gone over a little bit, but I do appreciate the chance to share this work and can certainly answer questions now or later. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Do we have any questions at this moment? Yeah, we've got one from chat from Tim. Are shortages more severe in certain subject areas? And if so, are there strategies that can address the shortages in specific subject areas rather than the teacher workforce overall?
Great question. So first, yes, like I think every state has reported shortages in special education, and in some states that's like a decade-long reporting. And in addition to subject areas, so special education, math, science, those are often recurring patterns of shortages, and then also in specific districts and schools across within districts. Historically, in some states, if you're able to see that, if their data systems show you that. And so one thing that you can think about is going back to like the service scholarships and loan forgiveness. I'll take an example from West Virginia, and apologize, I know I'm using a lot of examples there. I did a study there in 2019. They had a scholarship program that they developed. It was mirroring the North Carolina Teaching Fellows program, where you apply to it, you get essentially your cost of teacher preparation covered. But what they did is each year they would set out the shortage areas that people could go into to receive the scholarship. So you had to indicate you would become a special education teacher, enter that route, or a math or a chemistry teacher. And that would then give you access to becoming that kind of service scholarship and a whole bunch of additional supports. So you can design what is a policy for everyone, more or less, and refine it to make it target the shortage areas you need. And you can even design in policy so that is a reoccurring thing each year where you're able to look at the data and say, okay, we're starting to see more teachers enter there. We now need to look at this other area. Because again, I just want to use the North Carolina example. North Carolina had that program going back through the 90s. It was well studied. It was a wonderful program. And then it was shut down by the legislature in about 2015, I believe. And then within 2 years, they were trying to restart it because they were starting to see the negative impacts of the loss of that program. So just kind of demonstrating that in many instances, those programs are incredibly valuable in addition to other things. I hope that answers the question.
Any other questions at this time? I guess we will have time at the end too in our roundtable discussion, but any other questions before we move on to our next presentation? All right. Thank you again, Ryan. And yeah, I'll turn things over to Senator Craig to introduce our next presenter.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter, I guess, speaker will be Mr. Gary. I believe it's in Gary. Please forgive me if I pronounce the last name. I think it's Tipsor with the Illinois Association of Regional Superintendents of Schools, who will present on the outcomes of statewide surveys on teacher shortages and how it has influenced policy changes in Illinois. Since January of this year, Gary Tipsor has served as the executive director of the Illinois Association of Regional School Superintendents. Prior to this role, Gary spent 33 years as a public school educator in central Illinois, with the final 16 years as a school district superintendent. During his time as superintendent, Gary served as a member of Vision 2020, which brought about a change in the school funding model for Illinois. Gary has a part of the team, was a part of the team that assisted in the development, passage, and implementation of the new state K through 12 funding model. And he continues to monitor the progress of the formula as a member of the state's professional review panel. Today, Gary will share some insights on the genesis of the association's teacher survey that measures the extent of teacher shortages in Illinois. Explain how this survey can be replicated in other states and highlight the progress that has been made due to policy changes and discuss what more needs to be done. Gary, the floor is yours.
Senator Craig, thank you. And thank everybody for your interest in this topic. And I think what you'll find, you're going to see some similarities and a lot of alignment between what Ryan presented and some of what we have found in Illinois. And so before I get started, a couple of things. One, I'm going to try and provide context and intention to the slides. You all have access to the slide deck. You also have access to our comprehensive survey and report. And so hopefully when we get to the end, questions will actually drive better conversation. And so I'm going to try and work my way through this so that you kind of understand from a broad perspective what we've seen. And so first, if you're unfamiliar with Illinois, Illinois is unique in that we have over 800 school districts in Illinois. And the regional superintendents of schools, which is the organization that I represent as an executive director, we have 35 regional offices of education. All of those leaders, so our regional school superintendents, are elected officials. We also have 3, what we refer to as ISCs, Intermediate Service Centers. The executive directors that run those ISCs are appointed. But if you think of it in the simplest of terms, maybe the best way to understand it is in Illinois, you have an Illinois State Board of Education. And in between the Illinois State Board of Education and our school districts are our regional offices of education. And so they are a regulatory and compliance. We have responsibilities in that regard. And then the other is much of what Ryan presented that helps sustain school districts to be more effective and teachers be more effective. We have a role and responsibility in providing those services. So it is from that context and that role, that responsibility that this survey came. So in the second slide, and Derek, you have control of the slide deck. And so the genesis of the survey, and so why our association began the survey process was that in around 2011, we began in Illinois to change certain things about the credentialing, the certification, and the licensure aspect of what was going on. And it seemed obvious and intuitive to us that it was likely going to change the supply side of what was going to happen in our public schools. That we were going to, as a result of these changes, all well-intentioned, all to build a better, stronger, more well-prepared workforce, was going to result in fewer candidates in the pool. And at the time, that wasn't a concern because we had a surplus. We had plenty of people applying for jobs. And so when you work your way through this and you think about it, our offices are consistently the front line. So we're going to be the first to hear from school superintendents and school principals about any challenges that they face, where they are struggling to find candidates, viable candidates, appropriate candidates. And they're going to come to us to look for those emergency certifications, to look for those provisional certificates. And so when we began to see this grow, we felt it necessary to begin to ask questions. And so the takeaways from our 2023 survey, 91% of people surveyed saw teacher shortage as an issue. In some places, it may have been a moderate or minor issue. In some places, it may be a significant issue. And it really depends upon what you have access to. So from just a logic and a reason standpoint, you would assume in areas where there's a greater population density and areas where there's greater local resource, that problem is going to be less severe, less profound for them. And where there is less population density and less local resource, you're going to have greater issue. And logically, that just makes sense. And so I think the other piece that kind of showed up in this is that we're 80% of our school leaders. So think about the front end supply side of things. If the front end supply side isn't good enough, not only to drive people into the profession and into the positions that are open, you also then aren't getting a competitive pool. When I lived as a school superintendent, we might open a fourth grade position, have 40 or 50 people, 60 people, 70 people apply for that job early in my career. By the end of my career, we might have half a dozen. And so we were literally living the idea that not only were there not as many candidates, but the pool was also not sufficient to drive a truly competitive environment to hire the best and the brightest candidate. What we have found in the survey were three big things: burnout, compensation, and increased responsibility. All those things contributed to what we see in the broadest sense is the concept of working conditions. So how does it feel to actually do the job? Those were the things that our leaders said, this is what is creating and causing the teacher shortage primarily. Short term, what has the state of Illinois done? We've expanded the opportunity for our certified teachers that are retired to come back and teach for longer periods of time in the content areas in which they were certified without putting their teachers' retirement at risk in that process. We've expanded and increased the flexibility associated with reciprocity. And so bringing people in from other states that maybe were not educated in Illinois universities, that are coming from other states that come in and have an easier, faster access point to be able to teach in our classrooms. And then the idea of provisional and emergency certificates, which those run through our offices primarily. We're the ones that are working with local school districts to provide access to that, to monitor that, try and get them better credentialed, more appropriately credentialed, but also answer the questions and work directly with our principals and superintendents to ensure that they can do that. Sustainable efforts. So what we are considering as we look at things today, alternative pathways, which as Ryan talked in his presentation, there's increasing demand, need, and interest in those alternative pathways. Efficient and economical pathways for those that are already serving as paraprofessionals. That seems to be one of the areas in which we're trying to grow rapidly. We have these paraprofessionals, so think teacher aides. Our teacher aides that are in classrooms, that are working with students, are working alongside teachers. They understand the operational aspect of what it is to be in our school districts. And if we can provide a more efficient, economical way for them to pursue teaching degrees, they're already showing the desire to be there and work with kids. That just makes sense. I think, and this goes a lot to what Ryan talked about in terms of apprenticeships and internships and the way in which we think about that. And so engaging in more comprehensive conversations about how do we work with our current high school student population to incentivize and create an interest and develop capacities for them to want to pursue careers in public education. And then I think the last, and this kind of goes to the policymaking piece, and we need to think about, I've never talked to a legislator in my career where the policy that they believe in and the law that they want to create, what they want to pass, that they didn't deeply believe in that, believe that that was the right thing to do and that that was a good idea and it was going to serve the public well. We've got to be able to take the time to do two things. One, contemplate what does it look like as you play it out 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And two, take the time to talk to the people most directly impacted by that and leverage their expertise to best understand how they think that policy is going to impact public education or a particular section of public education over a longer period of time, so that we really make good decisions that aren't going to have a negative or unintended consequence. Additional considerations, I think we have to think logically about, in any profession, in any business, it's about lifetime earning potential. And so in career earnings, but also post-career earnings. So what are, in Illinois especially, the implications to the teachers' retirement system and how we look at tier 1 retirees and tier 2 retirees. Whatever your opinion on public sector pensions, you can live in whatever space of that you want, but objectively it has an impact. And so understanding that impact, and then what do we do about that impact, and how do we respond to it? That's an essential conversation. Supply side matters. So we actually have to generate enough people that can fill the jobs, but we also have to have a large enough pool of candidates to ensure a competitive environment. And I think these last 2 points on this slide, one of the things that we learned through the course of our response to COVID, and how the economy in general and the world of work in general changed. You think about even today's presentation. None of us have to be in the same space to have dialogue and to have this presentation. I can be an accountant and work for a firm in Chicago, but live in Austin, Texas, because I want to live in Austin, Texas, but the job is in Chicago. In education, I don't have that same luxury. We know that teachers at the front of the classroom engage directly with our students is the best way for us to teach kids. And so I have to live in or near where I'm going to work. And so if we're all competing for the best and brightest in business and industry and in education, business and industry has a different opportunity to bring to bear to attract the best and the brightest, the smartest and the most capable, the best communicators, the best planners. And now in education, we've got to compete in that space as well. And so we need to understand that that is a variable. And so this really brings the last piece here, is that uncertainty can't keep us from building new systems that allow us to be more effective and competitive in attracting and keeping and providing services that best educate our kids and provide best for the future of society. And so if you think in multiple states in a multi-state environment, should you be asking similar questions? I would argue it never does hurt to be curious. What we've learned, the right people, you need to figure out who the right people are to ask the question. In other words, what's going to generate the best response? Who are our school leaders? Who are our school districts most likely to communicate most effectively and most honestly with? And then once you get that information, share it transparently and honestly. Don't try and shade it or bend it to try and fit any one particular narrative. Allow the data and allow the information to stand alone so that we can have honest and direct conversations going forward. And I think the last piece is, be willing to build new systems based upon the new conditions that show up. We can't be stuck in a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 100-year-old model to solve challenges that exist in a system that's changing so rapidly. And all of that happens around good and consistent dialogue. And so I think the piece, and this speaks to what Ryan presented, when you look at our survey data, what I'm not sure is well understood is what is the definition of working conditions? I think every single person may define that differently, or it may land on that person differently. And so I think we have a responsibility in Illinois as a part of our organization who's going to continue to do the survey. We've been doing it since 2017. We're already making plans for our 2024 survey. We need to determine a better definition of working conditions. And then I think these last 2 points matter. Can we influence them? Once we know what they are, once we know that those are a challenge to continuing in the profession, do we have any influence? And if so, who has influence over it? And are they willing to do things to make those working conditions such that it incentivizes not only entering the profession, but sustaining within the profession? I just think we have to have broader conversations around that, because I think honestly, we don't fully understand that. And it is so widely defined by so many different people. And then lastly, what you have there, I provided the link to our survey. You can get access to that and dig in pretty deep. The partnership that we have with the group that does the study and puts the report and the dashboard together for us, I think does a fantastic job. And so you can dig in pretty deep to see what it looks like in Illinois. And then if anybody's interested in further conversations or you have questions, I've included our association president, her contact information, as well as my contact information. I would say, please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to engage in dialogue at any time about the things that we're seeing in Illinois and how we are trying to respond to that. And again, we're talking elected officials that are plugging into this environment and trying to work with our school districts in the best interest of students. So I'm going to end there and hopefully provide some time for questions here at the end. But Derek, I appreciate the opportunity to talk. Ryan, I appreciate the study that you have done and all that information that you brought to bear as well. So thank you, everyone, for being curious about this topic.
Thank you, Gary. Look if we have any questions, immediate questions. Go back to our one main page as well. Sorry. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Gary. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'll turn things over then to Representative Kitchens and stuff, and we'll get into our larger roundtable discussion.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for those presentations. We'll now go into the open forum and discussion. To kick off the open forum, we're going to call on Kansas Representative Mary Lynn Poskin to talk about the Kansas Teacher Retention Survey and how it can serve as a model for other states. So, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Kitchens. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I got involved with this when I introduced House Bill 2626 in March of 2022. I've served on our Education and K-12 Budget Committee, and this is a great concern of mine and a policy area that I was very interested in addressing. My bill doubled the appropriations to the Kansas Teacher Service Scholarship along the lines of what we had talked about before. Students agree to teach in Kansas a year for every year of the scholarship, and they agree to be credentialed in hard to fill disciplines and or underserved areas. So it was, my actual bill didn't pass, and I'm just going to put it out there because I'm a Democrat, but it was adopted as a budget proviso, and it became a foundational policy identified in the Kansas Board of Regents educator and work task. Along the journey of doing that, I found out about our Kansas Teacher Retention Initiative and actually have invited Dr. Brett Church here. That was initiated as a strategic coalition between the Kansas National Education Association, the Kansas Association of School Boards, the United Administrators of Kansas, and their purpose was to collect, analyze, and organize data so that it can be used to inform stakeholders as we confront teacher shortages. And I will turn this over to Dr. Brett Church from Emporia State University, because they've done some really fantastic work and the data is interesting, and we have a very high percentage of respondents. So as opposed to the K-12 budget chairwoman who said, I'm collecting data from my teacher friends, and had some data from about 100 people that she was using to inform her decisions in committee, we now have this incredible tool. Dr. Church.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity today to just talk very briefly about some of the things we're doing with the Kansas Teacher Retention Initiative. And I will not try to reiterate what I think has already been shared by both Gary and Ryan that are very much reflected in what we're seeing as well, but try to highlight a couple things that we may be doing a little bit different. So I partnered when I started at Emporia State with a gentleman who's also a Kansan, who's Dr. Luke Simmering, who's an industrial organizational psychologist. And so he worked with me on developing models where we could really get some actionable pieces, not only at the state level, and I've posted that state report in the chat, but also to start looking at the variance between districts as we look at what is really driving educator engagement and retention in our state. We started the survey in 2021, and we do it on an every other year basis. In 2021, we had a 50% response rate from all educators in the state of Kansas. That went to 60% in 2023. So we had a very large sample, and I think that's because of the partnership between the Administrator Association, the Teachers Association, and the Board Association in Kansas. What we also started to find after we had our first survey was that we were really getting higher engagement because we were really looking at that cost of teacher turnover. And I mentioned in the chat that we use the Learning Policy Institute data on that to be able to show economic development folks and commerce folks kind of speak their language a little bit more about what we're trying to show to districts to realize what it takes to invest in engagement and retention, and how that turnover and the cost of that turnover, not only to the economic impact, but also the relationships that we lose with teacher turnover. And then I think the last piece that I wanted to mention is just when we look at what we really try to focus on are drivers. So with 99% confidence, when we run a regression analysis, how can we find out what are the drivers for each district? And what we find is they're very different by district. So while we really give the state report as to drive policy and some of those pieces, we also know that just because ability to secure a substitute is a driver for the state, it may not be a driver in a specific district. So if they increase that subpay by $20 a day, that's an investment that's not going to have the impact on it as well as investing in something that's low satisfaction and a driver. And so we've set out the goal of providing districts with a 30% response rate, a standard report. And then we also have an additional report, but we're able to do the survey statewide and the standard reports based on funding from our partners. And then we're able, if districts want to get additional data, they're able to do that. And that gives them those specific district drivers. And I think that one of the things we've seen in our data is that 4 to 11 year band of teachers that I think really aligns with what Gary said about the change in the workforce and the change of work. We're seeing them as significantly more likely to leave the profession and significantly less engaged. And I think some of that is that piece on compensation. They're looking and saying the cost of housing, the cost of, the debt I have for college, and this is what I'm going to make each year if I stay in the profession. And they just don't see that as being sustainable for them. And then the last piece I wanted to mention is just kind of like where I think we're trying to head, and that is to really think about, we don't really know in, our other states, if we did this survey, would we see the same drivers? Would there be variance in drivers? Is Kansas unique? Are there some consistent pieces? We're starting to have conversations with other states. As a matter of fact, we've had some number of conversations with those same partners in Iowa, looking to try to expand possibly the survey so we can start building a more regional and growing that database. But also then looking at the idea of how do we introduce into the survey possible ideas that would be changes, and how do we look and see interest from educators, and specifically, what are those teachers that are in that 4 to 11 year or younger teachers, what are they saying? Hey, I'd be interested in learning more about this idea, as a way, instead of us just admiring the problem every 2 years and saying this is what it is, how do we use that same response to see where there might be ideas, and then try to see if with partners we're being able to have those conversations. So that's just a very fast, I know, and a brief summary of what we're doing. But also you can see in the chat not only the report, but examples of the reports that districts are getting. And one of the things that we're really excited about is we have seen those districts we're working on. The first district that really jumped on board having double-digit jumps between the 21 and 23 survey and satisfaction, up to 48% jumps in those areas. And a lot of it is teachers want to know that someone is listening. And the key, this specific district, they jumped 48% in the ability to secure a substitute, but their fill rate only went up 1 to 2%. But the difference was they were telling their teachers, this is what we heard from you. Here are the investments we're making to try to make this better. And here's how we're going to continue to get your feedback on how it's working. And that in and of itself, I think, is really helping their teachers and their engagement and their retention, because so often teachers just aren't aware of what districts are doing to try to improve that working condition or that environment. So, and obviously later I'll be happy to take any questions, but I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Okay, with that, I think we'll open it up for questions from anyone else that has any. I think the challenge, we all face across the country are facing this difficulty, and the challenge is to maintain quality of teachers while increasing the number, and also just trying to figure out which strategies as legislators we can use where we get the most bang for our buck in attracting new teachers and retaining new teachers. So I think those are the real key questions. So hopefully these surveys and such will help with that. So again, with that, we'll open it up for questions, and I'll count on Derek and some of the other members there to help me out in coordinating this.
Yeah, and just a reminder, yeah, you can definitely feel free to jump in at any time and whatnot and just unmute yourself. You can also like us to do the raise the hand function, or you can also put any questions in the chat as well. And thank you again to the folks from Kansas for putting all those incredibly helpful resources. And then again, too, I just want to reiterate a huge thanks to our two presenters, Ryan and Gary and stuff, for the amazing information that you're able to share with us. And I think the good thing is not just in this presentation, but this information is going to be shared on our website as well. So even people who didn't have an opportunity to join us today will hopefully be able to take advantage of that, a week or two, a month, a year from now. I guess one question I'll pose, if that's all right, Representative Kitchens, is, I just want to ask, we talked a lot about data collection stuff, but also when it comes to, we talked about licensing, and I know that some states, and I saw this when we were, and I'm going to turn my camera on, I apologize, if I can. There we go. I know I saw this when we were putting together the report that CSG Midwest had, but it was talking about the importance of compacts. And I just want to know from individuals who are from states that are part of, licensing compacts, particularly like the Interstate Teacher Mobility Compact, how has that impacted your recruitment efforts? And, has there been positives that you've seen? And again, we might not have representation of that on this call.
I can also flag that they're in the process of, I think that is getting, the committee that would oversee the compact is being stood up by NASDAQ, if we're talking about, yeah. And so they reached the threshold right away, so it's now able to be implemented, and there's more states joining. And I think it will be something the next year or two, I think we'll better understand how that's impacting the states that are participating. And I think there's also an effort, this is getting really in the weeds on teacher standards, but there's what are called the in-task standards. I'm not going to even try to tell you what that acronym means, but if you look up in-task standards, you'll find it. And those are standards that were developed alongside the Council of Chief State School Officers, and a lot of states have used to design the kind of what they envision good teaching to be and how they're going to measure it. And there's been conversations about revising those so that they could be a tool within the compact for people to kind of have apples to apples comparisons for licensure. Because again, that's another key piece of the compact, is how you identify what you'll accept from other states as well.
And I think that kind of relates to something that I've heard as well, is when we talk about, having this better reciprocity among states, it comes to the testing too. I know, in Illinois, we have our test. I mean, I'm a former teacher myself, and so I went through, the EdTPA process, and we were still videotaping ourselves. I think I was actually part of like the first class because I'm a little on the younger side. But I know that obviously a number of different states also adhere to the Praxis test, and I know does that help out really when you do have I don't know how many states there are, like 34, or maybe it's even more, who subscribe to the Praxis test? Is that the direction that people should be going towards, to have it so that it's one test and not having to go through all these different like state loopholes, or not state loophole, but yeah, loophole, yeah.
I can keep talking. I don't want to be the only one who should. So what I can say is, I think what the issue there might be is like some states put those assessments at different points in the process. Like I think Pennsylvania you had to pass a basic skills praxis before you could even enter teacher preparation. That has actually been removed since I think 2018 or 2019, or they did an emergency thing. Anyway, so in a lot of ways, the reciprocity may not necessarily be impacted by assessments, because ultimately it's whether you've achieved the licensure status. And so a state can design whatever assessments would get you to that licensure status. And as long as the participating states accept it, it would not be an issue. I think, there's a lot of pushback right now nationally on performance assessments, and whether it's just the EdTPA or in general. And at the same time, the other assessments kind of feel insufficient for measuring kind of what you can do in the classroom. So it's an ongoing tension. I'm not sure I've answered the question, but I think the compact wouldn't necessarily, assessments could help, but it may not necessarily be as impacted.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah. Go ahead, Representative Poskin.
Yeah, thank you. So not a question exactly, but just to clarify that Kansas did pass the Interstate Mobility Compact in Senate Bill 66 that is highlighted in the brief last year, but I don't know that we have had any data about it impacting Kansas yet. So that was just passed last year, and I haven't seen any data on it yet.
I'll throw something out there if someone wants to answer it, I guess. So we heard that in Arkansas, apparently they sort of raised their beginning teacher salaries more at the expense of the long term, and that doesn't seem like in the long term that's going to be a very good solution. It seems to me that young people often don't think ahead as far as retirement and and that kind of thing. So I would wonder how effective that is in recruitment. So if somebody can just talk about a little bit, if you're going to increase compensation, what's the best way to do it to achieve the goals that we want? Okay, I'll call on Ryan. So
I was practicing my wait time because, again, I don't. It just happens to be a lot of my colleagues play in this space. So I think, honestly, there's not a good every state should do this response there. One of the things, definitely, what's the entry point for salary in terms of how does that compare with the other states around you regionally? Because ultimately you're going to be competing, and we've seen examples of states that, like West Virginia, where their salaries lag behind Pennsylvania and these other nearby states, so they're constantly losing. Starting salary is important to calibrate, but then also thinking about the salary scale and how long it takes an individual to get to the top of that scale. And then what happens after that are all considerations, both for kind of that early phase of your career. How do you feel like you're progressing in relation to other people of similar professions? And then also, how do you think about the long term of your salary? And then to your point, I, as a former teacher who was like, I did international teaching, and I went to like a salary, like a retirement thing, and was completely like, I don't know, this doesn't seem important right now. I definitely think helping people understand the kind of implications of the retirement on kind of the other piece about the salary schedule is if you can increase the salary schedule or compress it so that you reach it higher, that also can have benefits to the retirement in terms of that calculation if you are a defined benefit. So those are some considerations that I've seen, and I know Brett wants to jump in here, so I'll step back.
I just wanted to mention, I agree. And I think one of the things that we've learned a little bit is that we're surprised by in how many districts salary is low satisfaction, but it's not necessarily a driver of engagement or retention. Because when people get into I'm a former teacher and administrator as well. When I got into education, I knew that it wasn't going to be the most lucrative position. But what was interesting in our state data between 21 and 23 is at the state level, it was low satisfaction and a driver of engagement and retention. And that was a question on your current salary. But 2 years later, the driver was no longer your current salary for engagement and retention. It was salary growth potential in the future, which goes again to that idea of I'm looking at I'm looking at a salary schedule and I'm saying I'll be 190 years old when I can afford a house based on this increase. So we actually even saw a shift in the item over 2 years from just not your current salary, but again, it's that voice of those younger educators that are saying it's not the right now, it's about where I'm going to be, and there not being any idea of how I can change that, I think is one of those challenges.
And there's also been some work in that same vein of kind of pairing leadership opportunities and growth, like a projection of growth for teachers in alignment with salary increases. I mentioned national board certification because some states, I'll use Washington State as an example, they provide an inflation adjusted pay bump that's about $555 or $5,500, and then an additional $5,000 if you work in a hard to staff school. And that's a yearly added on kind of incentive. So they're beyond just the salary schedule. There are other ways to increase kind of leadership expertise, taking on new roles that can also be paired with other financial incentives, kind of in that thinking ahead part.
Do we have further questions?
Real quickly on the question that was just asked, I think one of the things that we've experienced in Illinois, though, is if you create policy that inhibits post-retirement or makes post-retirement so undesirable, what we're experiencing is that works against sustainability, right? Initial salary schedules get people in, but to sustain beyond that 10, 15-year mark, post-retirement then begins to matter. Then they actually begin to look at it. That new teacher probably doesn't think about it, but to sustain teachers in the profession, retirement earnings certainly does matter.
I'll just add that to what Gary said, one of the anecdotal things that always stands out, we go out and do summits across the state where we try to get teams of a board member, a community member, a teacher on the negotiations team, a superintendent all together. And it's amazing the things that are shared. And one time in one of them, it's always stuck with me, was a superintendent said, it's interesting because I have a friend in town who makes well over, in the $300,000 or $400,000 a year range, whose spouse is a teacher. And they love the structure of the teaching profession because, $300 on the base isn't going to make a difference to them. But I also have a teacher who's a single parent and has 3 kids, and we're just putting them into the exact same situation and there are no options. And we're trying to serve all these different folks with the same model. And so one of the things that we've kind of briefly started to talk about is how do we give opportunities, whether it be through leadership or others, where it's not like everybody's negotiating their own salary, but maybe there are 2 or 3 options, like we have, for instance, with health insurance. I'm picking, I have 3 plans to choose from. Now my primary care cost is the same on all 3, just like plan time might be the same in all 3. But I might have some choice about things that I'm willing to do for additional dollars that we could build in and then give some choice. Now even that step seems like a very large step to many folks, but we are trying to meet the needs of very different backgrounds and experiences and situations in that case.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic when you look back at 50 years ago when most teachers were women and it was a second income. That's a whole different world than what we're dealing with now for most of them. So it is interesting. So any further questions? Well, I will close it out. I want to thank, first of all of you for participating, and this will be online. That I think there's a lot of good information here that we can use across the country, see what other places are doing. But I want to thank our presenters, Ryan and Gary and Brett and Representative Poskin, as well as my co-chairman, Senator Craig. So again, thanks again to everybody participating. Bye.
Thank you all.